Thanks there, Basil. Very nice words there. I've got to watch my P's and Q's tonight. I have a former CEO in the room with us tonight, Mr. Brian Hannon, who was our Methanex's first CEO back in 1992 or 3, something like that. So welcome, Brian. This evening I'm going to be spending a little bit of time talking about supply and demand from a global perspective, and then I'll finish off by touching on New Zealand. So I was just going to spend a few minutes talking about Methanex and what we do, the methanol that we produce, where does that go. So I've got a 30-second sound clip that I'll play there that explains it much better than I can. A little bit about energy and planning, where we've come from back in the mid-2000s, where we are today, what have we learnt from that. A little bit about a supply response to the changes that are going on around us, a demand response scenario, and a little bit about what we're doing in the space, and perhaps some takeaways or some ideas to consider for where New Zealand should position itself. So on that, I'll just play a quick clip. So we're a $5 billion company today. We've got 1,000 employees. We operate in 15 different countries. We produce methanol. Looks just like water. It's an alcohol. It's a single carbon chain. You can't drink the stuff. If you do drink it, you only get to do it once. And it's a very versatile molecule. So it's used for industrial applications all over the world. So as I said, it looks like water. If you burn it, it's colourless when it burns. You can only see it at night time. It glows with a blue flame. The Indy 500 racing car drivers use it for the Indy 500 races, and they've been using that for many years. It's primarily produced from natural gas. About 60% of the world's supply comes from natural gas, 40% from coal. And then that's pretty much it, really. The traditional applications, about 2/3 of the methanol produced goes into traditional applications. Traditional applications are things like formaldehyde resin, acetic acid, methyl methacrylate, all that sort of stuff. And it goes on to producing pharmaceutical drugs, paints, solvents, spandex, Gore-Tex, polyester fibres, so that ends up in clothing. Ends up as vitamin B, it ends up as adhesives, laptops, computer screens, flat screen TVs, cell phones, water bottles. It's all around us. So about 2/3 of the world's demand goes into traditional applications. And that's growing at about the rate of industrial production. So if the world's growing at 3%, that sector's growing at just a little over 3%. Then you've got the energy sector, and that's growing at double digits a year. It's one of the fastest growing commodity sectors in the world. So the methanol that's going into energy is primarily into gasoline blending, into making biodiesel. So 12% of your biodiesel manufacture contains methanol. It's used to produce synthetic LPG, which is a dimethyl ether. It's used to produce olefins, an MTO process that's primarily in China. The olefin is used to produce polypropylene mostly, and polyethylene, which are used to make water bottles and all sorts of stuff. And then there's a portion that goes into that's developing market is in marine fuels to replace bunkers. If you remember the Rena that ran aground in the Bay of Plenty some years ago, the bunkers that came ashore was that really heavy stuff at the bottom of the barrel of oil. So we replaced marine diesel oil in the Baltic Sea in 2016 onwards with effectively a methanol type fuel. So that's one of the threads that we're looking at the moment. So the methanol molecule is a very versatile beast. with incredible growth applications in energy substitution of oil products. So as a company, we need to do a little bit of thinking about how methanol fits into the broader picture. And so, we make $1 billion bets each time we make an investment in a methanol plant. You get no change out of $1 billion US today. It's a 20-year bet. And when you do that bet, you need to understand what your feedstock is. You need to understand what the security of that feedstock is. You need to understand what your sovereign risk is and what are your other commercial risks for such a large investment. So for us, if you can see that if we're too conservative in our assumptions, we'll lose our leadership position. Others will invest in the industry and we become less and less relevant. If we're too aggressive, we stand to lose our shirts if we get it wrong in terms of making incorrect investments based on incorrect assumptions. So there's a fine balance between being too aggressive and being too conservative, typical of any other energy companies in the space. So it's a high stakes game, and we've got to spend a lot of time focusing on what we believe are good assumptions going forward. So if we take a look back to the mid-2000s, just going back 8 years, what did the world look like back then? Clearly very, very different from where we are today. So oil was at $40 a barrel or less. We had a total disconnect between the commodities market like methanol, like ammonia, urea, from the oil industry. We also had an LNG market this is liquefied natural gas, that was a very, very small club of suppliers and niche customers, mostly in Asia, that represented about 4% of global oil supply in energy terms. So a very small energy player in the world scheme of things. We had coal running at about $40 a tonne, with Chinese coal consumption at 2.2 billion. I've picked out China because of the change that's occurred. So China's was at 2.2 billion tonnes a year, which represented about a third of the global oil supply in energy equivalent terms, to give you a sense of proportion. So the Chinese imported coal is basically, most of the coal around the world is a domestic commodity. It's not very well traded, and China was no exception. So 1% of its coal consumption was imported thermal coal. 1% of global trade was imported coal into China. Shale gas back in 2005 wasn't even heard of. The shale phenomenon in North America wasn't even on our radar screen. And the US was forecasted to grow by 10 million tonnes a year of LNG imports. So many players in the US were busy building LNG import regasification terminals, ready to receive investment in LNG. So here we are, and gas pricing was heading towards oil parity, or so the OPEC oil ministers had us believe. And so on the basis of these assumptions, the industry, went ahead and built a tremendous number of LNG plants, mostly in China, in Australia and in Qatar. So, but also, a few other places around as well. And so this forecasted boom in LNG was underwriting the investments that were occurring in Australia. So, and yet some of the molecules obviously go into the Asian markets, but this underpinned those investment decisions. And now you sort of roll on 8 years and see how it's different. So we've got oil tracking at just over $100 a barrel. The conventional oil supply remains unchanged at about 81, 82 million barrels a day. It hasn't really changed much in total. Now that's excluding the unconventionals like the shale and the tar sands in Canada. Methanol now tracks oil on an energy parity basis, so energy equivalency of gasoline in terms of the BTUs per gallon or gigajoules per litre. It trades on energy parity. LNG is now much more widely, there's a more liquid market for it, so there's a lot more trades in LNG today, more players, and it represents it's doubled in scale, so it's now just under 300 million tonnes a year of scale, 8% of the world's supply. Coal is now trading at $100 a tonne. It's taken a little dip more recently, as Solid Energy would attest to. And China's coal consumption is running at 3.8 billion tonnes a year. So 3.8 billion is about 50% of the world's conventional oil supply in terms of energy content equivalency. So China's grown dramatically. It now represents a quarter of world thermal coal trade. Shale has become significant, and I'll talk on that in a little while. And US is heading for energy self-sufficiency. In the space of 8 years, it's gone from being an importer that was expected by all the experts in the industry. It was going to go for an importer, from import status to self-sufficiency status in the space of 8 years. And here you are, making 20-year bets. How do you reconcile these bets with this level of change that's going on? So clearly, forecasts are wrong. So it doesn't matter what anyone says. Your forecasts are never right. It really comes down to getting some basic assumptions correct, and just picking a trend is difficult enough as it is. Even then, you've got a 1 in 2 chance of being wrong. So that's really tough. There's an incredible complexity of factors. We think of the oil supply as being in a bit of a bubble, but against that backdrop, you've got incredible complexity with regard to what goes on with demand drivers in economies, economic growth and substitution effects that go on. Incredible number of complexities that go on on the demand side in addition to the supply side. So you add that together, and it's not surprising that no one can really pick what's going to happen. We completely missed the global financial crisis. I remember meeting investment analysts in September 2008, and October it hit. And completely blindsided. And I'd say everyone in our industry was it's easy in hindsight. Yeah, we knew. No, we didn't really know. We just carried on until we were forced to adapt to that new reality once the months after October 2008 set in. We underestimated completely the Chinese growth, and we continued to, over the years, we continued to underestimate how they would accomplish their objectives. We got most of the geopolitics right in terms of who was going to do what to who, but we got the timing wrong. It's happened much faster. The Arab Spring has occurred so much faster than we ever expected. And we've got $1 billion investment in Egypt, so every day for us is a bonus. And then we have, clearly risks. Risks in 8 years, the risks have definitely gone up. And so how does that square with, investment strategies? So, and why is all this occurring? Well, some of you will have heard of, and read books on peak oil, and peak oil, the end is nigh, and we have to wean ourselves off oil, and the world's a gloomy place. And this plot here just shows the fossil fuel endowment that the Earth has spread over 500 years. I suspect there's a fair amount of poetic license in this graph. This is taken from David Archibald's presentation. I'm not sure where he got it from. But clearly, it does sort of roughly make sense to me anyway. But you've got oil, natural gas, coal and natural gas in terms of the consumption. This is of deliverability, annual deliverability of the product, expressed in barrels of oil equivalency against time. And it clearly states that it is a finite resource. There's no getting around the fact that these fossil fuels are a finite resource. They represent historical sunlight. Organic matter is converted into fossil fuels. It just represents historical sunlight, and so that historical sunlight has already been. So it is finite, What it shows really is today we're about halfway through our endowment of oil, a little bit less on coal and a little bit less again on natural gas. So is this what's causing the change that's occurred since 2005 to 2013? So oil going from $40 a barrel to $100 a barrel, is it because we've got scarcity of fossil fuels? So my personal view is that this has got nothing to do with it. And I think there's a heap of fossil fuels around that certainly in the next couple of decades it's not about the story. There is plenty of reserves available. The issue is this, in my view. This is all about OPEC, and OPEC is OPEC is organisation of petroleum exporting countries. It's the biggest monopoly cartel in the world. If it was companies doing what OPEC does, we'd be in jail. So you're not allowed to do what they do if it's private enterprise. But because they're sovereign states, this represents the biggest cartel in the world. And so this monopoly power gives rise to an incredible amount of conflict, and there are all sorts of issues going on behind the scenes in terms of power play, and man, there's a lot of stuff goes on here. So OPEC represents about 30 million barrels a day of oil supply. So the world's consuming, give or take, about 90 million a day today. So about a third of the oil supply comes out of OPEC today. And yet they have 78% of the oil reserves. And we think, oh, okay, that doesn't seem so right. So the oil reserves, so in the industry, in the upstream industry, you measure one of the key metrics that people follow is reserves to production ratio, R to P. So in the Western world, or in the non-OPEC world, you have about 11 years of coverage for the production that you produce. And the reason for that is that why would you have 20 years or 30 years of coverage? Because it doesn't make economic sense to be putting investment into getting a capital return in 20 years' time. So you put in enough capital to have enough cover in front of you as you're going along. So in the non-OPEC world, you're governed by a lot of financial discipline and a lot of, the weighted cost of capital is a really very strict criteria. So in OPEC, you've got 80 years of cover. Now the implications of 80 years of cover, so it represents 78% of the oil reserves worldwide and 30% of the production. And over the next couple of decades, that reserves to production, or that the remaining reserves after 20 years are going to be they represent about 90% of the remaining oil reserves in the world in 20 years' time. So do you think the power of OPEC is going to increase with time or decrease? Just figure that one out. And if you think it's going to go up, should we be doing something about it? And what should governments be doing about it? And we're just blindly following along if we just assume that this is okay. And I hate monopolies. It doesn't matter who you are, but government monopolies are the worst of all. And governments get band together and form a monopoly. That's got to be the worst of the lot. So, so these are not necessarily my friends. So this graph here is a graph that's taken from David Archibald. This is a graph that represents the cost of oil, the price of oil in constant 2010 dollars over two time periods. The first time period is 1994 to 2004, and it's against cumulative production, world production of oil. So the first, the blue line just represents the fact that we increased the production supply around the world for not a lot of change in price. It seems reasonable. And then you've got the red line that shows from 2004 to 2011, you've got this big increase in the price of oil. So you'd expect, economics 101, price of oil goes up, you'd think supply would follow, wouldn't you? Most people would do that. Well, of course, it's happened in the Western world, it's happened in the non-OPEC world, but in OPEC, the supply is constant at 30 million a day through that time. So if that's not monopoly behaviour in action, I don't know what is. So what we've seen, so I've talked about OPEC, now what about non-OPEC? Well, let's just take a look at the US for a second. And so the US is a very competitive, very transparent economy. It's probably the most efficient economy in the world. You've got here here's this little, there he is. So this is oil equivalency production, so 15 million barrels a day going all the way up to 21 million barrels a day. So from the 1980s right through to 2005, it dropped down and reached a low of 15 million barrels a day of oil production. And then something happened. So in 2005, 2006, we had this massive increase. There's clearly a response to high oil price. These guys have got off their chuff and actually gone ahead, deployed new technology, horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing of shale rock, deploying new technology and innovation in a very, very competitive environment. and everyone's going hell for leather. So you've had this massive increase in oil supply and natural gas supply in the US, driven by this innovation that's driven off the high price of oil. So here we have is a supply response to a high-priced environment. In a well-run, competitive, open, transparent economy, this is what happens. So you've got a 5 million barrel increase in the space of 5, 6, 7 years, and that trend is set to continue. So by 2020, we're expecting, a bit like the earlier slides, we're expecting the US to be self-sufficient in energy. So, maybe that will change, but certainly based on what we're seeing so far, that trend is still set to continue. So the shale gas resource is absolutely enormous. So you'd think, okay, well, does that, collapse the price of oil, if that keeps on going? So Saudi Arabia alone produces 10 million barrels a day for export. This is now 20, so it's twice the size of Saudi Arabia. So the oil that's going on, the oil production and gas production in North America is absolutely enormous. So what's happening is that the incremental demand that's being expressed in China and India and some of the growing economies around the world, basically the oil is being the supply chain is being rejigged. And so what's happening is that the volume of oil that's displaced here is going into the developing world economies. So, if you look at the shale gas in North America and say, oh, okay, well, would that apply elsewhere? Can that apply in other parts of the world? Is there shale rock just in North America, or is it everywhere? Well, actually, I don't know whether you can see that too well, but, North America clearly has, about, of the order of about 100 years of supply of shale gas there. We've got the Horn River Basin in northeastern British Columbia in Canada, big resource there. Since this graph's been put together, we've got there are big resources in Argentina. There's now resources in northeast England. There's Eastern Europe. We've got South Africa's got big resources of shale. China's got big resources in the west of China. Australia's got resources in the Cooper Basin, shale gas. And little old New Zealand's got resources, as we're figuring out now, in the east coast of the North Island. So there's clearly a lot of shale around. Now the question then is that the value that in the change that's occurred in the US, could that be replicated everywhere? So my view is that probably not. There are three things that are very unique to North America, or unique to the US. The first is property rights. So the landowner owns the resources below the ground. Pretty much everywhere else in the world, that doesn't occur. So where that doesn't occur, the landowner and the resource companies are usually in a bit of conflict because, well, don't mess with my land. And we see that pretty much everywhere we go, except in America. In America, the landowners are really pushing hard at this because this is a lot better than farming grain. So that's one factor. The second factor is there is an incredible complexity of pipeline infrastructure and gas processing facilities in North America that no other continent has, or no other country has. So anywhere in North America, you're not too far away from a pipeline. You can get pipeline liquids and pipeline gas into that, connected up, and it's an interconnection agreement right across the US economy. So you can find gas in North Dakota and have a customer in New York. And yet the molecules don't necessarily follow that way, but they'll just balance out into the network. Nowhere else does that. So you can get gas to market very, very quickly. So that's the second competitive advantage. No one else can replicate that today. And the third one is competition. So you've got unbelievable amount of competition in the oil industry in the North American scene. If anyone's been to Houston, you'll get an appreciation of the scale that you're talking about there. But the level of competition and innovation and the number of players, you're talking about thousands of suppliers here. Thousands and thousands of suppliers of services, niche services, and all of them have their own specialty, and they've got so much scale they can specialise. And really, no one else can actually beat that today. Now, so that's why our view is that, you know, it's unlikely to be replicated elsewhere, at least for some time. It might eventually, but not for some time. So there are three constraining factors that basically say that this is really more a North American story than a global story. So I've talked a little bit about supply. Just switch gears and just talk a little bit about a demand response, because what I wanted to do is give you an idea of the interlinkage with oil and what else is going on around us. Very few people would give any comprehension to the fact that oil has a relationship to food. And it's a very, very tight relationship. So the world produces about 2.2 billion tonnes of grains a year to feed 6.6 billion people on the planet. Now, of the 2.2 billion tonnes of food, about 1.1 billion tonnes of that would not exist without nitrogen fertilisers of some sort or another. You know, different types of fertiliser, but fundamentally it's nitrogenous fertiliser produces half the world's protein. And you can't get away from that fact. And so, and we call it agricultural productivity, call it what you like, but fundamentally you've got nitrogenous fertiliser going into producing food. Nitrogenous fertiliser comes from two sources, either coal or natural gas. Natural gas is linked to LNG, LNG is indexed to oil. Not surprising that the price of fertiliser is linked to the price of oil. Not surprising, therefore, that the price of food is linked to the price of oil. And in fact, about 60% of the operating costs of making wheat is the cost of energy. And the same is said for whether it's rice, whether it's soy, whether it's corn. They've all got a very, very big energy component. Fertiliser, pesticides, insecticides, the processing facilities that convert it from bushels to liquid, and the distribution system, moving trucks and tankers from A to B, or pipelines, whatever it is, it all consumes energy. And so when you look at all of that in total, about 60% of the food, cost of food, is the cost of energy. So what you're really seeing here is that food is a magnifier of the effects of high energy. And you know that to be true in your supermarkets. You know that to be true, you know, when in 2005, when in New Zealand, when, you know, fuel was $1 a litre, you know, you had your power bills and your utility bills, you had your food bills from your supermarket. You look today, you got your food is nearly twice what it cost in 2005. Oil's now twice what it cost. Your power bills is twice what it was. Do you think there's a correlation between any of these? And so, you know, fundamentally, food has the effect of amplifying the effects of energy. And the reason this is important is that it affects different people in different ways. So this is a plot again from David Archibald's presentation in Australia. This graph is a representation of how much of your GDP per capita is spent on food. And so for each country we have a percentage of food. So it's a pretty noisy slide, but you can see that in the lighter colours, these two colours in here, 0 to 10% and 10% to 20%. In the OECD world, we just arbitrarily cut off at 20%. So if the price of food per capita is less than 20% of your per capita income, you would consider yourself to be in the OECD world. And so, you know, so North America, I think, is the lowest at 6.9% of GDP is spent on food. A little bit more expensive in Canada. The UK is, whatever it is, I can't read that is, 8 point something. And New Zealand's running at 12 point something percent there. So, you know, there's a correlation there. And what this says is that if you look at the Middle East, in many of these countries here, you're running nearly half the per capita GDP is spent on food. Half of the income is spent to survive. It's not that surprising that the Arab Spring occurred. It's not that surprising. People are so in such a tight spot, they've got nothing to lose by creating anarchy from the regime that's there in place at the moment. Anything would be better, so they think, anything would be better than what they had until it happens. And then the current is way worse than what it was. But that's a process that, you know, so you end up with a social upheaval when the price of food is considerably higher than say 20% of your GDP per capita. So how this plays out is that in different countries, everyone's going to feel the pain in different ways. So in a high energy, so this is a graph that represents the income per capita relative to the US per capita. So the US is obviously 100%. So in the OECD world, we typically have about, up to, down as low as 70% of incomes across Europe, Japan, New Zealand, somewhere in here. Between 70% and 100% of the per capita income represents the OECD world over the last 40 years, from 1969 through to today. The rest of the world, with a few exceptions, sit down here at 0 to 20%. And you can see China here, up until 1999 was only a couple of percent of GDP. It's now climbed to a staggering sort of 8%. So it's had a big economic growth, but man, it's a long way to go. And so you can see that there are kind of two worlds here. You've got the world where you've got the effects of high energy that impacts food supplies, that impacts, where the earning capacity of the economies are far more constrained or far lower than this. It's almost like you've got a have world and a have not world, almost. You've got this, and that's getting magnified with time. It's not closing with time, and it's not to do with being good neighbours and good citizens. It's just, I don't know, it's just the way it is. It's, we're pretty lucky to be in this country, I'd have to say. So, but what this represents is risk. And so as the price of energy keeps on rising, how does this play out? And do you want to put your investments into these sorts of countries? Or do you want to put your investments into these sorts of countries? If you're going to be making a 20-year bet, where are you going to put your money? And how do you factor in the risks that might arise from social upheaval associated with, the masses not getting access to, low-cost food? And a lot of those economies, which, by the way, there's a number of OPEC countries that survive by virtue of their subsidy on food and energy that keeps their regimes in place. So. So the takeaways on supply, the first thing is that OPEC dominates. So we talked about the shale gas phenomenon that's occurring in North America. Unlikely to be replicated elsewhere, maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but we think it's not going to be replicated anytime soon. And so what's OPEC's response going to be? So if you look at OPEC's previous history, in recent history, you've got to think that they're likely to back off the throttle a little bit to keep the price of oil high. Why would they be interested in doing that? So Saudi Arabia has 28 million people today and generates 10 million barrels a day of exports of oil. It's got a very rapid population growth along with many of the OPEC countries. And so by 2030 they're going to have another quarter again population. And they'll be in a position not even to be exporting 5 or 6 million barrels of oil by then. And the rest of it will be required for domestic consumption. So they require by 2030, and I'm just using Saudi as an example, they'll require over $300 a barrel of oil to balance their books. Why is that important? Well, the regime needs to balance its books in order to keep the subsidies in place for its population, which is growing like crazy. And the subsidies come in the form of two forms. One is energy subsidy and the second one is food subsidy. So they need to keep the subsidies going and they need to keep their regimes legitimised by virtue of a high revenue stream. So they've got a very strong incentive, and you can plot every individual country within OPEC against what its break-even point is with oil. I've just used Saudi Arabia as one example. But it's probably at the lower end of the spectrum. There are plenty of other countries like Venezuela and Iran that require far greater levels of return to sustain their regimes or sustain the status quo. It's not to say the status quo won't change, but that's what's going through their minds. They need to keep that revenue going in order to sustain their position. So, clearly the shale is in the US is going to continue to boom. That's pretty obvious at this stage. That may have some sort of moderating effect on the price of oil. So Saudi might want to jack up the price of oil fairly quickly. That might be moderated. So how it plays out is going to be a tug of war between, what's the psychology of and the position of OPEC versus the position of the US, and that's going to, I don't know how that's going to play out exactly. Coal and gas consumption will continue to grow. Those peaks have yet to be achieved on both those two fossil fuels over the next 20 years. And clearly, there are disruptive innovators that might, bite us. So methane hydrates, the Japanese have been looking at methane hydrates for forever and haven't found a commercial way of extracting methane gas from liquid crystal hydrates at the bottom of the sea or just below the seabed. So that would be quite a challenge, how to get it out, but the world's got a lot of methane hydrates floating around. So, so that's one disruptive innovator that might occur. The other one might be thorium technology. So the US developed thorium reactors. This is molten salt. It's a bit like nuclear energy, but it uses thorium instead of uranium. And far safer, but there are materials of construction and containment that are pretty tricky challenges. But the US did develop some degree of pilotisation of that technology. The Chinese have bought that technology and are now spending billions a year on trying to commercialise that for themselves. They'd like to prototype that worldwide and become a leader in that space. Would that disrupt all this? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? There are, renewable fuels. What happens with renewable fuels? Do you think they're going to take off? And are they going to displace crude oil? Not anytime soon, but in our view. But the disruptors, need a level playing field in terms of it's got to commercially or economically make sense. And pretty much all of your renewable fuels, doesn't matter where you are on the planet, they don't really make sense unless you subsidise them. Someone's got to pay. So it's either taxpayers or mandates, which is really taxpayers or the motorist. Someone has to sort of balance the books. And if you don't balance the books and just let the market decide, you'll have no renewables, virtually no renewables. So it is a challenge. And as the price of oil goes up, the cost of renewables goes up because renewables is largely some sort of food. So the index that I talked about, at the 60% on oil to food, correlates also to renewables. So as the price of oil goes up, it's not that surprising. The cost of renewables also goes up. But the oil might go up at a far steeper rate than renewables. So at some point they should intersect. But at the point that they intersect might be at a point where there's a demand response. And I think the demand response is going to beat the renewables response. Because I think the demand response is going to come down to, first of all, how much can nations actually afford to pay for oil? And 7 out of 8 of the last 8 of the global recessions that have occurred in the last 50 years have been preceded by spikes in the price of oil. It's not rocket science really. So you know that as the price of oil goes up worldwide, you're going to be followed by a recession. 7 out of 8 is not a bad correlation. So clearly, and there's obviously an amplifier effect on food, and what happens to GDP consumption patterns. So if you go back to from 2005 to 2013, and look around you and look at what's happened with retail in New Zealand, just in our own backyard, you'll see that retail patterns have shifted. More internet online consumption. There's been a shift away from consumables to durables, similar to what our parents might have had, back in, the days following World War II. Where we've been very wasteful since, I'd have to say. But clearly, you're going to end up with a trend back towards durables. Now, again, with the rising energy price, what happens is that you get a loss in disposable income, because a lot of that income is going into the energy systems that support you. So that means that there's less economic activity, That means that there's less taxation collection by government. It means that governments go into debt. And what's happened in the OECD world, pretty much every country in the world, in the OECD world anyway, has gone into debt since 2008. Why? Because of this. It's all linked to what's going on with, in my view, I'm probably very biased on this, but in my view, I think it links back to energy. It's not the only link, but it's a core link. And I think at the end of the day, who adapts quickly and how is really the question that we need to be asking ourselves. We will all adapt, whether we like it or not. It's just a question of whether it's fast and painful, or whether it's sudden and brutal. But either way, it's going to affect everyone. So a higher oil price means that we have to adapt. The question is, for an economy, how do you collect and bring all of the population with you so that you don't make it someone's, it's the oil company's fault, or it's the utility, I know what it is, the electricity market's not working. That's what it is, let's regulate it, That's not going to solve anything. At the end of the day, you're pointing these blind fingers trying to assume that that's what the problem is. The problem is very, very fundamental. And this means is that you actually have to figure out how the economy consumes less energy to do what it enjoys doing. That's the fundamental trick when it comes to the demand side. What are the innovators? Well, I think Auckland University's got some smart people that are figuring some of the stuff out, but the nanotechnology, you've got graphene that might replace aluminium or replace steel in construction of vehicles. Who knows? I mean, there's all sorts of things that might occur in terms of innovation in demand space. But lots of smart ways of improving energy use. So Methanex, what are we doing? We're a little old global methanol company. That's all we do. We focus on methanol. We don't focus on anything else. And yet we've got our fingers in a lot of different pies. So we're working with some partners in Iceland that's making renewable methanol from geothermal waste CO2. So you convert the waste CO2 into methanol by capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, mixing with hydrogen, mix the two together. When I say mix, it's kind of a chemical reaction. So you mix the two together to produce methanol. That renewable methanol goes into the gasoline system in Europe today. So that's the top left-hand corner. Doesn't make economic sense. Not really. Someone has to pay, so the European Union is paying these great subsidies, and anyway. But what we're doing in the meantime is we're learning a lot about the space. What are the economics? How do they work? Can you refine it? Can you innovate better ways of making that work? In New Zealand, where's my little pointer here? So this is our Motunui plant, just north of New Plymouth, and then in the background you've got the White Trevally plant. So they were mothballed back in 2003. We were on our last legs. In fact, my orders at the time were to have an orderly shutdown in New Zealand, shift the assets offshore, and wind everything up. So I didn't quite follow instructions. So we've now got the Motunui plant running at full capacity. We're spending about $250 million of capital this year to refurbish one of the plants here and start up the second or third unit over there. So between those three plants, they make up 5% of the world's methanol supply. As that comes on, coal-based methanol that's produced in China comes off. So we've got a pretty competitive advantage in New Zealand. It's a great sovereign country to be investing in, very low risk. If you go back to some of the earlier slides, you can see why I'm very excited about New Zealand. So in that context, you might have complaints about, the Resource Management Act is inefficient and blah, blah, blah. That's trivial, really. In the scheme of things, New Zealand's actually a fantastic place to invest. Down here on the bottom left-hand side, you can see these big pre-assemblies. We're shifting 2,000 to 3,000 tonne pre-assemblies as we speak. We're shifting 2 methanol plants. These are big plants. These will be some of the biggest relocation kit in the world. We're shifting 2 of these plants at a cost of about $1.1 billion. to the US, to Louisiana, putting them up the Mississippi River. We'll unload them over the levee and onto the site, and we're going to be taking advantage of that shale gas over the next couple of decades. So that's very exciting. We can do it faster and cheaper than anyone else can do it. Why? Because we've got a couple of methanol plants that are sitting there not running at the moment. We've got 4 plants that are not running right now, so we're shifting 2 of them and we're deciding on the other 2. We've got a little picture in here. There's a picture of a ship. We've got partners in Scandinavia that we're working with. A company's called Stena, but one of a whole bunch of companies along with the Swedish government. And we're looking to convert ships in Europe in 2016. The European standards for atmospheric pollution from ships in the Baltic and North Sea is going to get tighter. And so they're going to have much, much tighter emissions standards for particulates, sulphur and NOx, nitrogen oxides. And so those standards can be met by either very, very ultra low sulphur marine diesel oil, which means that the refineries have to upgrade their refineries to remove trace sulphur from the diesel oil, or they can run the ships on methanol. So what we're doing at the moment is running some trials, running a ship on methanol to replace, so you don't run on bunkers in that part of the world, you run on marine diesel oil, you'd shut down your marine diesel, run on methanol. So methanol is effectively substituting diesel. So another diesel substitution. And then in Australia, we've got a vehicle testing program just out of Melbourne, a place called Geelong. It's the Ford testing facility. And we're testing a range of Ford Focus Commodores, Holden Commodores, and Toyota Camrys, and Falcons, and XR 6s or 8s or something. So we've got a range of vehicles that are being tested on a mix of gasoline, ethanol, and methanol. So all the way up to I think it's 85% ethanol and 56% methanol. So different mixtures, different cocktails. And what we're doing there is demonstrating the efficacy of alcohol fuels in transport. That's what we're trying to do. And once we've proved, it's been done for the last 15 years in China. China's now manufacturing 60,000 vehicles a year on pure methanol engines. So biggest car market in the world today is China, growing at just under 20 million vehicles, new vehicles a year. The US is about 15 million vehicles a year. So China is where it's all happening. And all your big vehicle manufacturing in the next 2 decades, it's going to be in China. So, you know, it's not surprising that Gallard's upset in Australia with the closure of Ford. Anyway, it's going to happen in China. They've got the scale, they've got the capability that's on a scale that the rest of the world hasn't seen other than perhaps the US in terms of GM and Ford there. So you've got this very exciting testing program that's underway there. We'd like to be able to import that testing program or the results of that into New Zealand, into the New Zealand context, and leverage there. So these are just some of the examples that, you know, here we are, Methanex producing methanol, and we've got our fingers in all sorts of different pies indirectly related to our industry. So I'll just leave on a slide that provides a few insights into the New Zealand economy. You know, what could New Zealand do to position itself? I would start off by just saying that there's a lot of things that we're doing already that is being done really well. So the government's actually embarked on a program of improving the way acreage is allocated in New Zealand. This is exploration acreage for accessing oil and gas reserves. And so they've gone through and streamlined that process. Some could argue that it's a step backwards. I would say it's a step forwards, because it means that players that can participate in that have got to have reasonably deep pockets and it weeds out some of the players that have got way less capability. And it's got to be good for New Zealand in terms of standards of performance. The second element, obviously, of that is good environmental regulation. And I think, my belief is that we've got a pretty good balance. You know, is it perfect? Does it satisfy everyone? You know, you're never going to satisfy everyone. But I think they've struck a pretty good balance. So the government has, you know, through the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, it's a bit of a mouthful, it replaces MED. But anyway, so that organisation or that arm of government has completed the process of rationalising the permitting process and the process of adopting pretty tough environmental standards. So now they're in the process of going out and promoting New Zealand as a destination for oil and gas explorers worldwide. So I think we watch the space. I think that's they're doing really well there. I think that's a tick there. The next one is creating an endowment fund for all new oil and gas royalties. This is a challenge. So do you fund the HIP operation today, or do you fund a child's education for 20 years away? And it's the dilemma that all governments have. In an ideal world, which is what Norway had, they ended up striking a bipartisan agreement between the left and right of Parliament 40 years ago, and it's stuck. And it would be good for New Zealand to have a bipartisan agreement between both sides of Parliament, a bit like the superannuation accord that never occurred. But could you actually have some sort of agreement, a cross-party agreement, that takes us off the political agenda and says, shouldn't we be putting some of the money that we earn from these fossil fuels into a fund that's intergenerational? Because what we're really doing at the moment is using all of the spoils that we create on the current generation. And what's for the next? And what Norway's done is it's gone from being one of the poorest countries in Europe to one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And one of the things that clearly they got a lot of oil and gas from the North Sea, but fundamentally what they've done is create an endowment fund which makes it the second biggest endowment fund after Dubai. And if New Zealand had a big oil and gas reserve, you'd think, wouldn't it be a neat idea to put a chunk of that money aside for future generations? So that's what we think anyway. The third item is opening up transport to competing liquid fuels. I think the surest way to sort out OPEC is competition. How do you create competition? You create competition in transport fuel. Right now, and the oil dilemma in the world today is a transport issue. It's not a power issue as in electricity. You can make electricity from renewables, nuclear, coal, fossil fuels, you name it. You can make it from, it doesn't matter what source, where it comes from, as long as it gets into the grid, the consumer doesn't really care. But a car runs on petrol and diesel everywhere in the world. It doesn't run on anything else. So while we keep focused on our cars running on only those products, we're beholden to OPEC. So clearly New Zealand is not going to lead the way in opening up the fuel standard and making us completely alcohol compatible. That feels like a step too far for New Zealand. It'd be good if we did it, but I don't think we'll do it. But we should be a fast follower. Now, a fast follower, so here we have Israel. It's just mandated 15% alcohols in fuels for the nation. They want to wean themselves off oil. And plenty of other smaller countries around the world are following suit. The country that's by far streets ahead of anyone else in the world today is China. And they don't have, I should use my words carefully here, but they have a group of people that are technocrats. They're professors and economists and what have you. Basil, economists. So they've got these group of smart people that figure out what's best for China. And they're not beholden to pork barrel politics or anything else. They just figure out what's best and then they get on and do it. And the rest of the world argues because of all the stuff that goes on in democracies, which is fine, but it makes it a bit slow for us. So here we are, China's churning out, it's got this alcohol regime or methanol regime in China. It's the fastest growing alcohol market in the world. And they're now even producing cars to run on the stuff on a dedicated basis. And what they're up to is trying to wean themselves off OPEC. That's what they're up to. And the rest of the world should be taking note and doing the same sort of thing. Now, New Zealand doesn't make cars. We obviously import our cars, so we can only go at the pace at which some of the super economies can go at. But we should be pretty fast behind, not a laggard. And I think this is part of our competitive advantage to if we can keep in there as a fast follower, I think that's really to the benefit of New Zealanders. Continuing to promote energy efficiency, EECA do a fabulous job. The insulation in homes program is brilliant. Should be ramped up and continue to make New Zealand homes are pretty damn cold. So anything that improves energy efficiency is a good thing. And last but not least is investing in sustainable public transport. We all talk about electric trains and electric this, that and the other thing, and until someone sees the capital cost of doing these things. And the capital cost is phenomenally huge. And but it's a case of internalisation of cost versus externalisation of cost. So while we sit on the motorway and it takes an hour to travel 6 kilometres, and we're competing with every other man and his dog on the road, someone's paying for that. And if you could take into account the effect of loss of congestion and factored the value of that into the economy, or factored that into the economics of mass transport, and I'm not advocating let's do it all tomorrow, but we should be chipping away at this thing year after year after year, extending the electrification, extending it. I'm a bit of a fan of electric trolley buses like we have in Wellington. I don't know what it would cost to string up those lines to run them down the main, like Great South Road and New North Road, and some of the main areas the corridors where the buses typically run, and just run them on trolley buses. I mean, trolley buses have been around for 50, 60 years, 70 years. So pretty low tech, but man, very effective. I don't know what the economics of that is, but it seems very sensible to me. So, we've got to keep investing in sustainable public transport. I think, well, first of all, I don't think there's any silver bullet to any of this. It's going to be a lot of activities, each of which will make some difference. You're not going to be, if you're looking for some sort of nirvana in this space, you're not going to find it. You're going to be disappointed. My view is that I think that the battery technology is a long, long way away from mass deployment and transport. Batteries are expensive, batteries are heavy, and they don't give you very many miles per gallon or very many miles on a battery charge. So you need to store energy some other way. And if you want to get away from petrol, I think the most economic way to do that from a very objective standpoint is using methanol. So you use methanol, you have an alcohol fueled, you have an alcohol engine. The alcohol engines are very light, they've got no water system on them, very high compression, very high efficiency, and you only run them to charge the battery. So you have a small battery, you have a hybrid plug-in hybrid alcohol engine. Whether it makes economic sense, time will tell. But clearly it's a low-cost way of extending the battery. So if you're travelling around the city and doing small distances, you can just use the battery and use the grid to charge up. If you want to go for a long distance, how do you charge up? So you need something to carry you that extra distance. And if it's not petrol, what else would it be? So it could be methanol, could be ethanol. Ethanol is quite expensive to make because it's a fermentation process, it's slow. Methanol is an industrial gasification step or chemical reaction that's 1,000 times faster. So there are inherent fundamental reasons why methanol makes economic sense. So I think that was, I just wanted to acknowledge these individuals and these organisations. Nothing that I've said is actually very unique. It's just a collection of ideas from other smart people around the world, and open to questions.